supposed to introduce Frank Kuchar. Frank Kuchar ran for House District, no, U.S. House District 6 against Joe Barton. Didn't succeed, did a good job. He may run again. He's a great constitutionalist, he knows the Constitution, he is teaching classes right now. We've got a class going. We're going to have future classes coming up. If you're interested, write your name down. We'll have a sheet, and we will let you know when the next class starts. Frank Kuchar.
Okay. Harlan says I need this, even though you all know I got a big mouth. Is this thing working now? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay, good. Before we get started, I want to also mention that last Tuesday evening was the inaugural broadcast of our Blog Talk radio program. I now have a 30-minute program on Tuesday evenings from 8 to 8:30 on the Lone Star Tea Party website, Blog Talk Radio. And the name of the program is Understanding Our Founders' Constitution with Frank Kuchar. Understanding our Founders' Constitution as opposed to Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid and Barack Obama's Constitution. Going back to the original intent of it. And I'll be pulling in some current event stuff and tying it to the Constitution. Those of you that are in the class, you'll notice that last week's lesson, it's also archived, and the one coming up Tuesday night, you're going to say, that sounds real familiar. It's because it is. It's material that we've covered in the first lesson in our 12-week course that I'm teaching in Ovilla. For those of you from Duncanville and Grand Prairie, if you get your groups up and going and you think there's enough people that have an interest in having a 12-week course on the Constitution, I'm more than willing to come and teach it. Because even though you would not be in the district that I may run again in, the point is this. Our country is in a lot of trouble because people do not understand and appreciate our Constitution. And my aim and goal is to educate. And the more I can educate, in district, out of district, I don't care. The point is to get enough people trained and understanding our constitutional rights and liberties that are being taken from us by the encroaching general government so that we know how to fight and get our rights back. So I encourage you, if you have an interest in that, to listen to that program. Now, for those of you that are in the class, this material is going to sound familiar because it is what we covered just last Monday. So I hope I won't put you to sleep, but it'll be a good review. The subject we want to talk about, well, I pushed the button, Harlan. You said page up, right?
No.
Page down? There we go. The wrong one. Got it. Nullification and state sovereignty. Everybody know what nullification basically is? There's a big issue about it, a big debate. And you'll find a lot, even among conservatives, who say nullification is not constitutional. Well, by the time we get done this evening, you're going to know better than that. Because what my presentation is going to be is not talking about what's going on at the state in Austin, the group that's trying to get together to nullify certain unconstitutional federal laws. What you're going to learn tonight is the constitutional and historical basis that substantiates and proves that nullification is indeed a right that states have always had to nullify unconstitutional federal, or I should say general government rules and laws, because we are no longer a federal government. We are no longer a federal republic. We are a centrally controlled, top-down type of government, getting worse by the day. So, with that being said, Keith said, can you get through all this stuff in 30 minutes? I said, I will. Yes, I will do it. And so I'm going to try and keep my promise, Keith.
Oh, we need you to actually do it in 20 now.
No. Quiet.
Take you away.
How many have heard me speak before? You know surely he jiffs.
Yes.
Because for those of you who don't know me, I started out as a minister. And so now you got a double problem. You got a former preacher and a guy that's involved in politics now who was running as a politician. And you expect me to get this done in 20 minutes. Ain't gonna happen. Okay. Hopefully it will be enough interest that you won't mind if we run 30 minutes or maybe a few minutes over. Limited government and states' rights. Here's what happened. Is everybody familiar with the two groups that founded our country, the two philosophical groups, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists? If you don't, those who argued for a stronger central government they appropriated to themselves the inappropriate name of Federalists. Those who were in opposition to the Constitution as it was in the terms of the ratification debates that went on through the states, had no choice. They were the true Federalists. But because Alexander Hamilton and Madison and Washington and the others appropriated the name Federalist to themselves, they had the unfortunate situation to have to choose the name Anti-Federalist. And they were the ones who were really arguing in favor of states' rights. They were the ones who were afraid that we were going to have an all-powerful central government that would basically end up swallowing up the states, and the states becoming just appendages of a general government, kind of like what we see today. And here's why. They had reason for their fear. This is what one of the Federalists said during the constitutional debates in 1787. George Reed, who was a delegate from Delaware, said, "Too much attachment is betrayed to the state governments. We must look beyond their continuance. A national government must soon, of necessity, swallow all of them up." You see why some of these guys that came from these states that were opposed to a strong central government, all of a sudden alarm bells were going off? Because understand, what were these 13 states? They were not states like we think of today. They were states in the sense of the state of Italy, the state of France, the state of Germany. They were sovereign, independent nation states in their thinking. Because in the Treaty of Paris, after the War of Independence, King George, when he signed the treaty recognizing the independence of the 13 colonies, he signed a peace treaty with each and every one of them named separately as sovereign, independent states. So these guys come to this convention, that's what they're thinking. That's who we are. And all of a sudden somebody gets up and makes a statement like this, they say, "I don't think so." Put yourself in that situation. You're used to thinking of yourself as a separate, independent entity. And all of a sudden somebody says something like this, what's going to go off in your mind? Alarm bells, whistles, red flags, and everything, right? So here's their response. Those who opposed the Constitution in the ratification convention in the state of Pennsylvania, they lost the vote. But they issued a minority report. In their report they said, "The main pillars of the Constitution, which we have shown to be inconsistent with the liberty and happiness of the people, as its establishment will annihilate the state governments and produce one consolidated government that will eventually and speedily issue the supremacy of despotism." Were they right? Does that not look like what we face today? Thomas Jefferson agreed with them. Let me read you just a couple of quotes from him. And this time I got them marked, so I can get to them real fast. This was a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote August 13th, 1800, to a gentleman by the name of Gideon Granger. See if this doesn't sound like today. "What an augmentation of the field for jobbing, speculating, plundering, and office building and office hunting would be produced by an assumption of all the state powers into the hands of the general government. The true theory of our Constitution is surely the wisest and best, that the states are independent as to everything within themselves." Anybody say Obamacare? "And united as to everything respecting foreign nations. Let the general government be reduced to foreign concerns only, and let our affairs be disentangled from those of all other nations, except as to commerce." Okay. Kind of sounds like our world situation today, maybe. "Which the merchants will manage the better, the more they are left free to manage for themselves." Oh, geez, regulations. Okay. "And our general government may be reduced to a very simple organization and a very inexpensive one." Anybody think $1 trillion deficits? "A few plain duties to be performed by a few servants." Who's the biggest employer right now? Who's had the most employment gains? The general government. Thomas Jefferson, 1800. Well, let me give you another one. The suppression of now this is his second inaugural address when he was re-elected president, 1804. "The suppression of unnecessary offices, of useless establishments and expenses enabled us to discontinue our internal taxes." Imagine that. Limited government cutting back, taxes going down, right? What a concept. 1804, okay. "These covering our land with officers and opening our doors to their intrusions, have already begun that process of the domiciliary vexation which once entered is scarcely to be restrained from reaching successfully every article of produce and property. Light bulbs, how much water your toilets can flush, what kind of cars you can buy, what kind of mileage you got. Yeah, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? 1804. Well, let's take a look and see what happens. Their concern, the Eighth Federalists, was that states would disappear under the Constitution. The federal farmer, one of those who wrote in opposition to the Constitution, said, "The plan of government now proposed is evidently calculated totally to change in time our condition as a people. Instead of being 13 republics under a federal head, it is clearly designed to make us one consolidated government." Was the guy prophetic or what? But as to powers, the general government will possess all essential ones, at least on paper, and those of the states a mere shadow of power. But the state governments must be annihilated or continue to exist for no purpose. We're not there yet, but is that not the direction we're headed? Another one. They argue that our union would be a union of states guided by the principle of federalism. John Taylor, who was a compatriot of Thomas Jefferson, of whom Jefferson said, "I have never had any disagreement with this man at all. He and I are almost on the same page with every article, every thought." And this is what he wrote in a series of essays in 1823. These are compiled in a book called The New Views of the Constitution of the United States. And if you want to really read a good book on states' rights, limited government, and so on and so forth, I really highly recommend his writings. "The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union," a reference to Article 4, Section 4. "Thus it is positively asserted that our union is a union of states and not of individuals, and that it is a guarantee by states to states and not of an American nation to states. The sovereignty of states is necessary both to undertake and to require the fulfillment of the guarantee." In other words, he says, it was not a contract, the Constitution, between the general government and the states, or the general government and the states. It was an agreement of state to create the general government. And if you listen to my broadcast from last Tuesday, this is the material that I covered and talked about. That it was not a people or states together creating the general, making a contract with the general government saying, okay, this is what we will allow you to rule as, and here's the rights that we expect to keep. It was amongst themselves that said, okay, let's create this government, here's what we'll let it do, but no more. We get to keep everything else. It was an agreement amongst themselves because the government cannot exist prior to the people forming it. This is the critical point. This is why I'm going to spend the time that I am right now on this very issue, because this is critical. When people begin to tell you, no, nullification is not an option, this is the information you've got to have in order to combat that and to refute it. So, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union. Okay. There is mutual and exclusive supremacies in this. The Constitution, again, John Taylor, by dividing powers and declaring itself to be supreme, prohibits either the federal or state governments from usurping that character, and the powers assigned to each to be held under its supremacy express a prohibition against an assumption of supremacy by either over the other. It establishes a mutual and collateral tenure and fealty of both under its own authority, and not a tenure of fealty of one under the authority of its co-partner. They were co-equal. They said, you work in this realm, we'll work in this realm, we won't step into your pond and you don't step into our pond. That was the agreement of the Constitution. Now, again, Jefferson was in agreement with this. Let me give you another quote from him. Yeah, okay, this one. This was a letter that he wrote to Elbridge Gerry, January 26, 1799, 10 years after the ratification of the Constitution. "I do then with sincere zeal that an inviolable preservation of our present federal Constitution, according to the true sense in which it was adopted by the states, that it was advocated by his friends." He says this, and I'm not opposed to the Constitution, I am in favor of it, but here's what I want to say. "I am not for transferring all the powers of the states to the general government, and all those of that government to the executive branch. I am for a government rigorously frugal," novel concept, "and simple. applying all the possible savings of the public revenue to the discharge of the national debt. Imagine that. Jeez. Strange idea, isn't it? And not for a multiplication of officers and salaries merely to make partisans, and for increasing by every device of public debt on the principle of its being a public blessing. Translate that, general welfare. Now, that was the argument for the states. Again, John Taylor, the word federal implies a league between sovereign nations, has been so used by all classes of people from the commencement of our political existence down to this day, and is inapplicable to a nation consolidated under one sovereignty. He says, if we have one sovereignty, then we're not a United States, period. He went on. See why I recommend this guy's book, these essays? The Constitution most wisely availed itself of the good motives which induce men to combine by making the interest of the states the basis of the union of states. That's the basis. And the interest of individuals the basis of states' rights. How is this thing built? General government, states, people. People are the foundation of all of it. But between us and the general government to protect us is the states. If you take away their sovereignty and their power, then where is your guardian to protect us from the encroachment of the general government? It's gone. But they're saying that's what they're there for. And if they can't nullify unconstitutional acts and laws, then how can they fulfill their purpose? By dividing instead of concentrating supremacy. Okay, now, another quote from Mr. Jefferson. Let's see, yeah, here we go. This is his first inaugural address as president. And in this one he says, considering this is the general tendency to multiply offices and dependencies and to increase the expense of the ultimate term of burden when the citizen can bear, it behooves us to avail ourselves of every occasion which presents itself for the taking off the surcharge of taxes and so forth. He had earlier said that when we consider that this government is charged with the external and mutual relations only of the states, the general government is supposed to try and keep peace between the states, kind of be like the umpire referee between the states. That the states themselves have principal care of our persons, our property, and our reputation, constituting the great field of human concerns. We may well doubt whether our organization is not too complicated, too expensive, whether offices or officers have not been multiplied unnecessarily and sometimes injuriously to the service they were meant to bring up. Sounds a lot like the government we have today, doesn't it? Yeah, it does. Sad to say. But continuing, another important statement. Granting sovereignty implies possessing. Can you grant something that you don't have? Could you give somebody a grant of money if you don't have any money? No. So then you cannot grant power or authority if you don't first possess that power or authority. You cannot say, I'm going to give you this much authority if you possess none of it yourself to begin with. And yet it was the states that granted to the general government, this is the authority we're going to give you. This is the power you are going to have if they didn't have it to start with. Again, Mr. Taylor, if each state or the people of each state did not possess a separate sovereignty, they had no right to convey or retain powers. If they had a right both to convey and to retain powers, it could only be in virtue of state sovereignty. By supposing that these sovereignties conveying limited powers to the federal government convey also a portion of sovereignty, it must also be allowed that by retaining powers, they retained also a portion of sovereignty. Correct? Makes sense. If sovereignty was attached to the ceded powers, it was also attached to the powers not ceded, because all or none of the powers of the states must have proceeded from this principle. Now, you wonder if Mr. Jefferson agreed with this? Anybody want to take any bets on that? Well, I don't want you to lose any bets. This was a letter that he wrote to Supreme Court Justice William Johnson, June 12, 1823. But our general objects are the same: to preserve the republican form of government and principles of our Constitution, and cleave to the salutary distribution of powers which that has established. In other words, it established a separation of powers: states, general government. These are the two sheet anchors of our union. Listen to this last sentence. If driven from either, we shall be in danger of floundering. We floundering today? Why? Because we departed from our Constitution, we departed from the principle of federalism, the principle of republicanism upon which our nation was founded, plain and simple. Throw in the fact that we're spiritually bankrupt, and we've got a double whammy. Moving right along, promise to keep Albury. The states will still be sovereign, is what the Federalists said. The Federalists said, oh, no, don't worry. All you guys that are all up in arms, you'll still be sovereign despite what that one delegate said. They said there will be an equilibrium of power between the federal and state governments, just like you've been arguing for. Hamilton wrote, and Hamilton was no friend of limited government. I know what he wrote in the Federalist Papers. He wrote very well, but he didn't believe what he wrote. Because when he got the chance to have power as Secretary of Treasury under George Washington, boy, that guy flipped, and he was just wanting as much power as he could get. He wanted the executive to be a lifetime appointment. He wanted the Senate to be composed of the aristocracy of the colonies for life. He wanted to model us after the parliamentary system of Great Britain, because he thought that was the end all. So anyway, but he did write some good stuff. So in Federalist Paper number 31, he wrote, everything beyond this must be left to the prudence and firmness of the people, who, it is to be hoped, will always take care to preserve the constitutional equilibrium between the general and state government. So who is at fault for the mess we're in today?
People.
Look around. All of us. Our forefathers. That is why I said, if anybody wants to have a constitutional class, whether it's in the 6th Congressional District, in which I may run again or not, doesn't matter. We have got to teach people our constitutional rights and liberties, period, wherever they are. Because if this country goes down, we lose all of our rights. Those of us in the 6th Congressional District, we're not in the cocoon. We're not a little island. We go down with them. So anyway, this is kind of like the preamble of the Constitution. Ultimately, all power resides with the people. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, to hereby establish this Constitution of the United States. States will still be sovereign, they said. Division of power between the two sovereignties. Again, Hamilton, number 33. The necessity of a concurrent jurisdiction in certain cases results from the division of the sovereign power and the rule that all authorities of the states are not explicitly divested in favor of the Union, remain with them in full vigor, is not only a theoretical consequence, but is clearly admitted by the whole tenure of the instrument which contains the articles of the proposed Constitution. Hamilton, who was a strong central government guy, said the Constitution guarantees that not in theory, but in actuality and in full vigor and full authority, the states will maintain their sovereignty and their authority and their power. Madison. Each state, in ratifying the Constitution, is considered as a sovereign body, independent of all others. In relation then, the new Constitution will, if established, be a federal and not a national Constitution. Do they regard the establishment of the Constitution, the states should be regarded as distinct and independent sovereigns? They're so regarded, as the Constitution says. Beyond limited powers of the general government, the states remain sovereign. Again, Madison makes this point. Now, another one, I want to get on to some other things. The federal government is argued to be dependent upon the states for its operation, while we can get along here in Texas just fine without the federal government. Thank you very much. But the federal government can't get along without us. Theoretically. They can now because of all this, because of the 16th Amendment income tax. But who has to approve amendments to the Constitution? The states. Can anything be altered in the theoretically?
Yeah.
Theoretically, constitutionally, can anything in our system of government be altered without approval from the states? No. Do they do it anyway? Yes. Are they authorized to do so and empowered to do so? No. That's why we've got to rise up and assert our rights again. Madison. State governments will have advantage of the federal government whether we compare them in respect to the immediate dependence on one or the other. The state governments may be regarded as constituent and essential parts of the federal government, whilst the latter is no wise essential to the operation or organization of the former. That's the way it was set up to be. And we completely turned that on its head nowadays. Again, Madison. Federal government owes its existence more or less to the favor of the state governments. The reason why we should maintain the 17th, get rid of the 17th Amendment, so that the states appoint their senators to represent their interest in the general government and not elect. Now, what do we need the Senate now for? We elect popularly the representatives. Why do we need two houses of representatives? Because under federalism, you've got a house that represents the people, and you've got a house that represents the states. 17th Amendment destroyed that. And that's why we got to get rid of the 17th Amendment, but that's another discussion. This issue is at the very heart of federalism. This is perhaps the most famous quote in the Federalist Papers on this topic. I'm sure you've heard it. Federalist 45, written by James Madison. The powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined. Think Article 1, Section 8. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. And this is before the 10th Amendment. The former will be exercised principally on external objects. As Jefferson said, on foreign things, foreign affairs. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. So if Massachusetts wants to have Romney care, knock yourselves out, Yankees. Have at it. We don't want socialized medicine down here in Texas. But don't give that to the general government, tell the general government to come down here and tell us that's what we got to have. Each state is to be its own in those internal matters of personal affairs, not the general government. So, let's sum up the arguments that the Federalists made that support state sovereignty. First of all, federal government created by the people through their state ratifying conventions, and the states determined what rights and portions of their sovereignty they would give up. That's Federalist number 39. Second, the powers of the federal government are severely limited, while only a few of those powers of the states are limited, leaving them in full sovereign possession of all others. So stated in the Federalist Papers number 33, 40, and 45. The branches of the federal government will be dependent upon the states for their existence and not vice versa. We read one of those quotes from Federalist number 45. The rights of the states will be protected due to the state legislatures controlling the appointment of senators to the Congress. Federalist Papers number 40 and 43. And like I said, the 17th Amendment destroyed that. To amend the Constitution, it is the state legislatures that must consent to their ratification and addition. Federalist Papers 39 and 43. So clearly, the framers never, ever intended that the states would become mere vassals of the general government, but that they would share power, maintaining their sovereignty within their respective realms, and neither was to encroach upon the other's area of operation. That's the way it was set up. But this is not the picture we see today, is it? We're far from that. So the question is, well, how did we get into this mess? As I said before, passage of the 17th Amendment destroyed the ability of the states to exercise a check on the encroaching power of the general government. Thank you, Woodrow Wilson and the Progressives in 1913 that also gave us the income tax. Expansion of the limit of the general government beyond its constitutional limited enumerated powers, and we the people letting it happen. Not raising up a voice. Of course, it wasn't we that exist here today, but we allow it to continue, don't we? Because we do not send people to the House, to the Senate, that will stand up for these rights and put us back on the path to constitutionality. So we may not have gotten this into this mess, but we perpetuate it. Failure of the courts to support states' rights. No big surprise there, huh? And states becoming dependent or addicted to federal funds. Money talks, right? The states have become like minuets, is it minuets, whatever, those little...
Marionettes.
Yeah, the little puppets with the strings.
Marionettes.
Marionettes, thank you, Kate. Marionettes. And we dance to the tune that the general government plays. They manipulate those strings. You want that money? Play by our rules. Do what we say, or you don't get the money. You remember what happened to us just recently? When we decided that, no, we're going to enforce our citizens' Fourth Amendment rights, and you TSA people can't sit there and grope us all over the place and everything. And what did the general government do? Oh, yeah? Well, then you do that, and we're not going to let any airplanes fly over the state of Texas. And our state legislator backed down.
Yeah, Lieutenant Governor.
Well, whoever, they cater. But why did we not stand our ground? Because the federal government has money, they got regulators, they got things they can control. If we want to get back to true state sovereignty, Republican form of government, federalist in our government, we have got to start cutting those strings and become free again from their control. And that the money's where it's got to start, which means we've got to get people in Congress who will again stand up and say, we're going to get rid of all these federal governments that are not constitutional, that are tying the states to the general government.
Fair
So
tax.
they can be free. Pardon me?
Fair tax.
Yes, the fair tax would be a good way to go, but well, that's another subject altogether again. And I've only got a few minutes left. What recourses do we have here in Texas and every other state in the Union? Appeal to the judiciary? That's what we did with Obamacare. How'd that work out? Here's the problem. It amounts to having one branch of the general government judge a dispute between another branch of the general government in the states. They can't be impartial, can they? That's having the fox guard the chicken coop. Besides this, forget about the logic. The Constitution does not give the Supreme Court of the United States jurisdiction in cases involving controversies between states and the general government. You read Article 3 and the amendments that are attached to it, and you will not find anywhere in that Constitution where it gives the judiciary the authority to judge between disputes between a state and the general government. It isn't there. And why? Why? Because the states had their right to nullify to begin with. They didn't need the Supreme Court to judge between the state and the general government. They had the authority to stand on their own feet and say, as a co-party to this compact called the Constitution, we have a check on you, and we don't need to go to the federal court. That's why my argument is, we didn't need to take Obamacare to the court system. We didn't need to. And that's why we're seeing this rise in an interest in nullification. Because that is how you stop these types of encroachments. I know, I'm getting a little worked up, but dadgummit, it makes me mad. How about secession? You seen these bumper stickers? The Texas flag, secede. Yeah, there you go. Can we do that? You'll even hear conservatives such as Mark Levin, say, no, states can't secede. The Civil War proved that you can't secede. You know what the Civil War proved? One thing. Might makes right. Didn't prove a doggone thing when it comes to the rights of the state to secede. Did some good things come out of it? Will preserve the Union, but it also put a really big spike into the coffin of federalism and states' rights and authority. It did, outlaw slavery. That's a great thing. I'm glad we finally got that settled and done. But not only at a cost of a lot of lives, but as a cost of the very principle of the government that we have. Perhaps that's a good trade-off. Because slavery needed to be eliminated. But we needed to then say, okay, slavery's eliminated, now let's get back to federalism and republicanism form of government. Many claim it is off the table, but did it? Jefferson and many others felt that states had the right, but only as a last resort. I don't have time to go into and read to you some of the statements and the quotes that Jefferson made along this regard, but I can just tell you that he wrote, as a last resort, states do have that right. And that's a entirely different discussion. Okay, state nullification, federal laws and actions. That's what this whole thing is supposed to be about, and I'm just now getting to it, and we're getting near the end of our time. But you see now why I had to give you all this preparatory information. Now you have the ammunition. When somebody says, we do not have the right to do it, all these things I've just been reading to you and giving to you substantiates the fact that yes, we do. Yes. Obama said, yes, we can, and now we can say in terms of state nullification, oh, yes, we can. That ought to be our slogan.
Yes, we will.
The basis is the fact that the states gave life to the federal government, not the other way around, and as we've already seen, they are still sovereign entities and not vassals. Despite how it may look and despite how it operates, that's not the constitutional framework in which they were set up. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798. How many are familiar with those? Just a few? Do yourself a favor. Google Kentucky, Virginia resolutions. Or just Google resolutions of 98. In 1798, the Federalist Party controlled Congress and the presidency under John Adams. And they had passed the Alien and Sedition Act, which is a lot like the National Defense Authorization Act that was passed back in December, and the proposed Enemy Expatriation Act that Joe Lieberman and somebody else in the House came up with, that basically take away our rights, our Fourth Amendment rights, our Fifth Amendment rights, our Sixth Amendment rights. And Jefferson said, wait a minute, you can't do this. And he convinced Madison to help him write these resolutions in opposition to what the federal government was doing. Jefferson wrote them on behalf of the Kentucky legislature, and Madison wrote these resolutions on behalf of the Virginia resolution. Our legislature, rather. And they were arguing that the general government oversteps its constitutional authority granted to it by the states, and when it does so, its actions are null and void. Jefferson was more strong in his opinions than Madison was. Madison kind of comes in and says, we really don't think this is right, and we really wish you wouldn't do it, and we'd like for other states to consider with us and appealing to the representatives and the senators in Congress to not do this and to repeal it. Jefferson, God love him. Oh, man, Thomas Jefferson, where are you when we need you? He was a little bit more blunt. He used the words null, void, or of no force no less than 10 times in these series of resolutions. And just to give you an idea of what these were like, I want to read you several quotes from them, and I'm going to do it in rapid fashion. I know I've been talking kind of fast already, but we're going to really kick it up, because I want you to see, like, blow after blow after blow after blow of a hammer on an anvil, the strength and the power of what Jefferson wrote. Listen to these. Proposition number 1, this is the entire proposition. Resolved that the several states composing the United States of America are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to the general government, but that by compact under the style and title of a constitution for the United States and of the amendments thereto, they constituted a general government for special purposes, delegated to that government within certain definite powers, reserving each state to itself the residuary mass of right to their own self-government. And that Whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. How much plainer can you get? That to this compact, that is the Constitution, each state acceded as a state and is an integral party, its co-states forming as to itself the other party. That the government created by this compact was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself. In other words, the Supreme Court is not the final word in what is and is not constitutional. If somebody says, well, the Supreme Court declared it, therefore it has to be. No, it doesn't. Why? Because, again, you've got the Supreme Court being its own judge. The states determine whether or not something is or is not constitutional. Since that would have made its discretion and not the Constitution the measure of its power. But that, as in all other cases of compact among parties having no common judge, each party has an equal right to judge for itself as well as of infractions, as of the mode and the measure of redress. The federal government can block something that the state's doing, the states can block something the federal government. They are each judged of one or the other. There is no common judge between them. Resolution number 2, here's just a portion of it. Resolved, he comes along and at the end he says, and all other their acts which assume to create, define, or punish crimes other than those enumerated in the Constitution are altogether void and of no force. And that the power to create, define, and punish such crimes is reserved and of the right appertains solely and exclusively to the respective states, each within its own territory. Number 3, resolved, therefore, the act of the Congress of the United States passed on the 14th day of July, 1798, entitled an act in addition to the act for the punishment of certain crimes against the United States, which does not abridge the freedom of the press, is not law, but is altogether void and of no effect. Not only is it void, it's not even law. Resolution number 4, the act of Congress of the United States passed the 22nd day of June, 1798, entitled an act of concerning aliens, which assumes power over alien friends, not delegated by the Constitution, is not law, but is altogether void and of no force. Number 5, resolved that to remove them when migrated is equivalent to a prohibition of their migration and is therefore contrary to the said provision of the Constitution and void. Resolution number 6, resolved that the imprisonment of such a person under the protection of the laws of this Commonwealth on his failure to obey the simple order of the President. Now he's talking about the people of Virginia, that the general government coming in and imprisoning a citizen of the state of Virginia based upon this unconstitutional federal law. He said because that person failed to obey, didn't buy health insurance. Okay, you see the application? Let's read the rest of it. As is undertaken by the said act, is contrary to the Constitution. The same act undertaking to authorize the President to remove a person out of the United States is contrary to these provisions also of the Constitution, is therefore not law, but utterly void and of no force. That transferring the power of judging any person who is under the protection of the laws from the courts to the President of the United States is, as is undertaken by the same act, is against the article of the Constitution, and that the said act is void for that reason also. Resolution number 9. Resolved, this Commonwealth does also believe that to take from the states all the powers of self-government and transfer them to a general and consolidated government without regard to the special obligations and reservations solemnly agreed in that compact is not for the peace, happiness, or prosperity of these states. And what does the preamble say that we're forming this government for? For those very purposes. And that therefore this Commonwealth, that is Virginia, that is Kentucky, is determined, as it doubts not its co-states are, tamely to submit to undelegated and consequently unlimited powers in no man or body of men on earth. That if the acts before specified should stand, these conclusions would flow from them, and that the general government may place any act that they may think proper on the list of crimes and punish it themselves, whether enumerated or not enumerated by the Constitution as cognizable by them. Continuing, This Commonwealth does therefore call on its co-states that they will view this as seizing the rights of the states and consolidating them in the hands of the general government with a power assumed to bind the states, not merely in cases made federal, but in all cases whatsoever, by laws made not with their consent, but by others against their consent. Okay. Again, do I need to say where we could apply this to? And to live, that this would be to surrender the form of government we have chosen. In other words, the form of government we set in this Constitution is gone by the boards. And to live under one deriving its powers from its own will and not from our authority. Our authority being what? The states and the people. And that the co-states, recurring to their natural right in cases not made federal, will concur in declaring these acts void and of no force. What do you think? Could Jefferson have made the argument any plainer? Could he have made it with any more force? No. Do we have the rights to nullify? Yes, we do. So the state nullification of federal laws. Here's another, I can do it in about another 5 minutes.
Okay.
Do states think they have the right to do so? Look at some early history. 1812, during the War of 1812, the legislature of Massachusetts protested some sanctions imposed by the general government during that war. And here's what they said. A power to regulate commerce is abused when employed to destroy it, and a manifest and voluntary abuse of power sanctions the right of resistance as much as a direct and palpable usurpation. The sovereignty reserved to the states was reserved to protect the citizens from acts of violence by the United States, as well as for purposes of domestic regulation. We spurn the idea that the free, sovereign, and independent state of Massachusetts is reduced to a mere municipal corporation without power to protect its people and to defend them from oppression from whatever quarter it comes. Whenever the national compact is violated and the citizens of this state are oppressed by cruel and unauthorized laws by this legislature is bound to interpose its power and wrest the oppressor from his victim. Again, sound like Obamacare? Daniel Webster, speech, December 9th, 1814, in opposition to a bill for conscription in the Army, draft. The operation of measures thus unconstitutional and illegal ought to be prevented by a resort to other measures which are both constitutional and legal. It will be the solemn duty of the state governments to protect their own authority over their own militia and to interpose between their citizens an arbitrary power. These are among the objects for which the state governments exist, and their highest obligations bind them to the preservation of their own rights and the liberties of their people. Summed up, our founding fathers considered the Constitution to be a compact between citizens of the states to which they created the federal government, and that the states were sovereign, independent parties to that compact, and therefore on an equal footing with the general government in that compact. Second, the intent of the Constitution was to limit the powers of the federal government, and that the majority of the power within the nation was to rest with the states and their citizens. Third, whenever the federal government exceeded the limitations imposed upon it by the states within the Constitution, the states not only had the right to oppose him, but as we saw in some of those here in Massachusetts in Daniel Webster's speech, the obligation to do so in order to protect their citizens, a duty which was their primary reason for existence. That's why we've got to let our folks in Austin understand this is not something we want you to do. This is your job. Yeah. You are obligated to do this. It's not a choice. It's not an option. Fifth, or fourth, whatever one we're on now. Any and every law passed by the federal government, which is not within its limited and enumerated powers within the Constitution, is therefore, as Jefferson said, no law at all. As a consequence, it is null and void, and the states are completely within their authority to ignore the enforcement of it within their respective territories. Should the federal government take action against the citizens of the state for failure to obey, it is the duty of the state government to take up their case and defend them. So what recourses do we have? Legitimately. Two, constitutionally. Secession, but only as a last resort. As I said, that's a whole other discussion. Or nullification, as we've just seen. That is what our rights are. The 10th Amendment. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. What part of that do you folks in Washington not understand? And that's it. There's another lengthy quote that I wanted to read you from Jefferson that make you think it was written right off of yesterday's newspaper, but I don't want to take the time for that. Anybody have any questions or thoughts or comments you'd like to bring up?
Because Washington controls the purse strings. Austin says, we're not going to do it. Washington says, you don't do it, we're not giving you back any of your own money.
Yeah.
I don't think we can do this without the fair tax.
Well, the fair tax, Henry, is still going to be getting the federal government money. And they're still going to be sending money
After it
back.
passes through Austin.
Yeah.
After it passes through Austin.
But still, you know what the solution really is? Go back to the way the Constitution originally had taxation set up. Tariffs, which we can't really do that too much nowadays, but through appropriation. Very quickly. Appropriation, how it was back then is, okay, Texas, you have 9% of the population of this country, you've got to cough up 9% of the revenue needed by the general government. If we had that, what do you think would happen when they want to build that stupid light rail system there in California? Our folks here in Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, everybody will say, ha! You nutcakes want that light rail built out there, high-speed rail built? Pay for it yourself. We ain't going to kick in a dime. But because the government, as Henry's pointed out, takes the money from us without us having a choice, they can get away with it. But that's not going to happen because almost every state in this union is in the red with their budgets. But ideally, that would solve the problem. And we get into the problem when we get away from the Constitution, the wisdom of these men that set up our government. Any other questions or thoughts? I want to take one more minute on another topic.
Clock is ticking.
Yeah, but this is good. Our country's in a heap of trouble, isn't it? Y'all feel a bit depressed, worried, concerned? Yeah, I do too. Worries me to death. There were a couple of English guys by the name of Trenchard and Gordon who wrote a series of essays on political liberty and freedom back in the 1720s in England. It is said that perhaps the collection of their essays, it was a 4-volume set now down to 2,